Special broadcast of the Union Budget. Joining us live from Mumbai, Mr. Law, we may manage to provide internet, but what do you have to say about digital literacy, and has the budget really tackled that issue as well?
Well, I mean, he has talked about certain aspects of the whole skilling thing. He talked about Sankalp. He talked about, enhancing the e-learning platform. That was something quite interesting. The whole, the new testing mechanism. He said the CBSE, etc., can, deal with examinations, deal with the academic part and bring in far more amount of e-learning. But is there anything specific on digital literacy? May not be. But I think it's very clear, Chaiti, that the larger point that digitization, cashless economy is here to stay. He's basically attacking it from two fronts, right? He's trying to bring more people into the tax net. He's making cash more difficult. So to that extent, and as Rohit mentioned, right, there is that whole bit about one of the few exemptions that he's made on the excise front has actually been on the POS machines, etc., which are going to facilitate. So yes, this is a budget that comes in the wake of, a very, very big event, which was demonetization. And he's not going to let that just go. So there is a clear thrust. If you look at it in the overall scheme of things, how much is there specifically on digital literacy, etc.? Well, he's talked about it, but there's nothing really grand in terms of announcement, so to say. But I don't think that was really expected either, right? The budget, if you ask me, he's outlined, it's a very workman-like budget. He's outlined the 10 themes which this government has believed in and has been talking about ever since it came to power. Within that, there is a bit of give. An articulation. If you really see, Chaiti, and we've seen this all the while, right? The market knows everything, and I was just seeing the ticker on your channel which says in 12 years this is the biggest gain the Nifty has seen on a budget trading day. What does that tell you? What it really tells you is that for the almost 2 hours that he was speaking, the market was completely flat. It was literally waiting with bated breath that I just hope, there are no nasty surprises. So there were no nasty surprises. We can talk about some of the good measures that have come out of it and a lot that really hasn't come out of it. Was it really a reformist budget? I don't think so. But it was a very workman-like budget, and that is perhaps what, everyone was looking forward to. That just keep us stable. Don't come up with something that's just going to upset the stability factor, and I think that's why the reaction that you've seen coming out from the market.
Vivek, most of the cash transactions in the country are way below the rupees 3 lakh limit. So what is the rationale behind this limit? Even if the government removes duties on points of sales, how does it incentivize people to swipe their debit cards?
Well, I think, Rohit, so there are 2 or 3 things. Now, is this 3 lakh limit, where it's been plucked out of? He said that this has come from the recommendations of the SIT. Why is it 3 lakh? Why is it not 2.5 lakh or 2 lakh? Only the SIT or he can answer. But I think there's a larger game plan here in place. So if you look at what he's done with the people who are earning up to 5 lakh, what he's saying is to encourage them to come into the tax net. He is saying that, there'll be just a one-page form. There'll be no scrutiny for you. Come out there and start paying taxes. So that's, I think, the larger message. It's not so much about, cutting from 10% to 5%. Of course, that's really going to make a lot of difference for people who are in the 2.5 lakh to 5 lakh range. And I think you can guess it as well, that you are going to see a big impact of that in the elections that are coming up. But the point is that what you're really doing is you are tracking. So there have been a lot of reforms silently, not so much in the budget, but you're linking things to Aadhaar increasingly, you're linking things to PAN increasingly, you're data mining a lot more. You heard some of the statistics that he talked about post-demonetization. He's talked about a very significant number of people. I think it was 1.09 crore people, accounts, which actually deposited between 2 lakh to 80 lakh rupees. Now, the problem really with the tax administration has been its complete lack of focus on technology. You have a great database out there. You can actually track if you want to, and if you really invest in, people actually sitting and monitoring those data, the data mining, which is completely absent. But he's talked about that. He has said that, I think the reason he went into specifics and gave those numbers of post-demonetization and the cash deposits was basically to say that, look, we're finally actually going and mining data, which is something which countries the world over have always done. Developed countries, actually their tax administration is more about technology and less about a bloated workforce, which is completely the reverse in India. So at least a start is being made on that front. Whether it's 3 lakh, you're absolutely right. It could have been 1 lakh for all you know. But the point is there is an increasing audit trail that is going to get created as you move people to digital and less of cash. And I think that's where the killer is. If you look at the numbers he's talked about of the cash deposits, I think he's really pegging a lot of enhancement in tax revenues with this data mining, with what is being seen otherwise in terms of the audit trail, moving people to cashless. And I think that is where the tectonic shift is, not so much in 3 lakh or 2 lakh or 2.5 lakh.
So we're gathering that widening the tax base in a tax evasive economy is the takeaway as well from this. Stay with us, Mr. Law. We're going to come back to you in just about a bit. Now, the government has been portraying itself as a warrior against black economy by talking about curbing the Benami transactions.
Voluntary disclosures of income scheme is something that need to be looked at seriously. Income Tax Amendment Act and several others. And this time, they announced cash donations to political, parties will be limited to 2,000 rupees. Earlier, this number was at 20,000 rupees, and most of the money that was given at the 20,000 mark was, called as unaccounted property, unaccounted money that was paid. Now this has come into the tax net. It'll be 2,000 rupees. You can also have bonds for it. So certainly black economy and the money that the political parties were utilizing, and we looked at that number in the last 10 years, about 11,300 crores was taken in by the political party. So certainly a lot of change there.
Right. We also have Mr. Sanjeev Ahluwalia, the advisor of Observer Research Foundation, joining us right here in the studio. We're going to ask you how will this put a limit to the opaqueness in the political donations as well in this country?
Well, not completely, because you can have 1 million people, donating 2,000 rupees to you in cash. And the political parties are not obliged to keep a record of who's giving you money or when. And, institutions like the ADR, who do work on political parties reform, have actually recommended that not only should they keep a full accounting of the money that they take in, but also that it should be available through the RTI process to citizens. I think we're not there. There has to be a political consensus around it. You will notice that most political parties, when they come up in a public forum, are going rah, rah, this should be done. But they're also very hesitant to actually enter into this for obvious reasons. So this is a start that the government has made. I think it's a good start. Think of it as a signal. The budget is all about signaling. The budget is not the end game for the entire year. It's really just the beginning of the year, and a lot of signaling and posturing and optics goes into it. And this was certainly one of them, because if you will remember, in the press, the government was being criticized that, if you wanted to go after black money, as you were suggesting, why don't you go after political parties? Because they're completely unaccountable. And so I think this particular measure is something which tells you that the government is serious. It will try to bring in more reform measures, and this is the beginning.
Mr. Ahluwalia, also the Finance Minister, and yesterday the Chief Economic Advisor of the country talked about speedy remonetization of the economy to bring the GDP back on track. Can you give an insight about this?
Well, the economy is remonetized already. I think that as far as availability of cash is concerned, maybe that's what you're referring to, that how easily can people get cash today. The situation is already fairly normal. ATMs are working, limits have been removed, you can go into a bank and pick up whatever money you want. And so cash is again flowing. But the real issue is that, does it really fit in with the government's original objective, which was to reduce cash? I think that's the question that you started with. And I'm afraid that, there can be no single surgical strike which will stop people from using cash, nor is it desirable. Don't forget that, we're sitting in Delhi, everything looks hunky-dory. But you go into the boondocks, and the boondocks are just 70 kilometers from here. And it's a completely different ball game. Net may not be available. Place where I live in Almora, net is rarely available, right? So this is the reality of India. And in that part of India, where 80% of the poor live and 70% of our population lives, cash is still king. And personally, I really don't have an issue with that because, what we need to do is focus our energies, go after the big unaccounted money, and forget about the ones who are making a few pennies on the side. Because this is a country of 1,300 million people. You can't do everything at the same time. No, and certainly not the central government.
Well, I'm with you. Getting phone networks, forget even getting internet, sometimes not available in places like Almora. So it's certainly a challenge. Infrastructure is the lifeline of a nation. It determines the success of businesses, connectivity of people, and basically the overall working of the economy. There are several initiatives announced for the same.
And the initiatives are the infra allocation is at a record high, and the allocation for the highways has been increased as well. The pace of roads construction has been accelerated. The AAI Act will be amended for land monetization. Metro project allocations increased as well. 1 crore houses for the homeless by 2019. Affordable housing given the infra status in this particular budget.
Joining us in the studio is Brajeshwar Singh, who is the former NHAI chairman. As far as the infrastructure is concerned, the measures announced by the government are positive. Will these measure and will this improve the standard of living for citizens as well as corporate businesses? Mr. Brajeshwar Singh, we've seen tremendous growth, at least during a lot of the regimes in the last, maybe 3 regimes I've seen, even during Vajpayee's time, then during Manmohan's time as well. But now, do you see there is a further impetus onto infrastructure? Will we see the changes on the ground?
Well, I'll just speak first on transport infrastructure. I think the big change in this budget was some magic words which the Finance Minister used and which no one paid much attention to. He said we're talking about a multimodal approach to transport, which is we're not saying highways at any cost. We'll say, would a railway line be better? Do we need to improve aviation first? Do we need to do a waterway first? The problem in India is we don't have a single transport ministry. We have the railways as an empire within government. We have shipping and highways together, but civil aviation is again looked after by somebody else. So to get an integrated transport policy has always been a problem because of coordination problems. But the Finance Minister has said, yes, we're going to look at transport in a multimodal framework. There are alternative modes which we have to decide on, and we'll take what is the best. He's also announced a very aggressive target of 3,500 kilometers for railway construction. And the railways between 1947 and 2010 were averaging something like 100 kilometers a year of new line. I think 2010 we raised it to about 200 kilometers. Now to jump from 200 kilometers in 2010 to 3,500 in 17-18 is going to be a very big leap. And this is a revolution in railways, virtually what he's talking about. So I think much of the stress he was giving was actually on the railway side. He also talked about doing PPP models for airports and said tier 2 cities, we will do new airports through PPP models. Unfortunately, we have a large number of tier 2 cities with 0 flights. I mean, Durgapur has an airport, there are no flights to Durgapur. So a PPP model works if you've got sufficient traffic to generate a cash stream. So there's a revenue stream from which you can service your equity and debt. Many tier 2 cities, or I can't think of any actually, which would be attracting sufficient traffic to have a PPP kind of model working effectively. So I think there'll be some misses in what has been announced in the transport sector. Certainly infrastructure for civil aviation we'll have to relook, do as much as possible on budget, make use of the existing assets, and of course we've got the UDAN scheme and other things to sort of expand the civil aviation network. I hope these work out. But I think his big stress really was by merging the railway budget, saying I'm taking a multimodal approach. and announcing very aggressive targets for the railways. He also talked about improving the operating ratios. Now, how this can be done without either reducing railway overheads or increasing tariffs or doing both, I don't know. The details aren't there in his speech. Maybe once we get the details of the railway budget or the sectoral allocations, we'll have a better idea. But certainly he's laid a lot of stress on transport infrastructure, and he's pushed up the outlays very substantially.
Right. So thank you for highlighting the impediments that the public-private partnership models are really going to be facing in terms of the regional connectivity in India as well. We also have Vikash Kumar Sharda of PricewaterhouseCoopers joining us live from Chennai. Mr. Sharda, good evening and thank you so much for joining us on this telecast. Now, infrastructure sector is prone to maximum amount of corruption. How can the government really curb that? Could you throw some light on that?
See, I mean, if you really look at infrastructure, I mean, largely you'll find that, it kickstarts basically the construction activities. And the moment you have these construction contracts, normally you will believe that, a lot of corruptions are involved. I'll really not get into kind of, the how corruption can be curbed or something, but I think definitely the digitization push from the government side on, making it the payment more, the online and then the cashless, the transactions by the contractors to their laborers or the workers. I think those are some of the steps which the government has already taken that will definitely help in curbing the corruption.
Mr. Brajesh, let me ask you, because what we've seen in the last few years, the integration really has not really been taking place. Even if you look at a small microcosm like the city of Delhi, for example. The Delhi Transport Corporation and the metro are really not aligned. Give us a sense that is this practical, the integrated approach, because all of these organizations have, worked on their own in their own direction, and we haven't seen that integrated approach. Is this too aggressive?
No, it isn't aggressive. It's a beginning. And it's a beginning we simply have to make. And you've highlighted the problem that we have coordination problems unless you have some kind of overarching authority or some way of coordinating the efforts, you won't get there. But unless you say, look, I'm not going to look at a railway project until you've evaluated, would a waterway or an airport or a road be the better solution? Which is you're taking a multimodal framework right up. It's a question of how do you frame the question. The old way of letting individual departments do their own thing is not the way to go forward. Certainly this is a step forward. Whether it succeeds or not depends on how much political control the government wants to exert and how much pressure it's going to go and how well the individual ministers work together. I think by and large we're lucky we're in a political system where we are not having huge ego clashes, which was what we had in the coalition governments of the last couple of years. And ministers are more cooperative with each other. So I think there is a chance to go forward. As far as Delhi is concerned, that's a different question. There's diarchy, there's an elected government, there's a lieutenant governor, there are two layers of government. Sure. And there is also a certain, and when you're talking about transport in Delhi or any of our metros, you're talking about urban planning. I was noticing that among the sensitive technologies which the US lists out, it's not just nuclear or nuclear physics. Urban planning is one of the sensitive technologies they don't want to share. We are not very advanced in urban planning. We have a lot of leeway to make up. And certainly multimodal transport systems within cities and multimodal public transport systems are the need of the hour. Do DTC buses pick you up from a metro station? Yes and no. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So that kind of integrated approach is necessary at all levels, not just at the national level, but even at the city level.
Sure, absolutely. Literally anything that you look at, the integrated approach is certainly going to help. But obviously, a lot of the departments will have to put their egos behind and work towards the integrated approach. The government has announced a surprising move as far as the FDIs are concerned. FIPB has been abolished as from the scheme for trade, export, infrastructure has been announced. Let's talk a bit more about the FIPB. Vivek, explain to us what does this do for people who are thinking of investing into India? How will this accelerate foreign direct investment in India now?
Mr. Vivek Law, this question was for you about the Foreign Investment Promotion Board of India and the FDI influx that we would likely be seeing on the back of the abolishment of the FIPB.
hear you.
Mr. Law, I'm going to repeat the question. The question really was about the FIPB, but we can probably go over to our studio guest now to take over the same question. Now, the FIPB has been completely abolished, really. Now, what really happens to the foreign direct investments that are coming into India now? There's a single window clearance, and all the FDIs coming in will be under automatic route. There is no other option. So, how do you view that move?
I think the reason why the government has, as you say, abolished, rather a strong word, I think they've just kind of allowed it to die, because it's a bit like a little organ in the government that's no longer needed. So if you don't really need an exceptional way of getting foreign investment into the country, why do you need a separate body doing that? I mean, foreign investment, domestic investment, it's all the same thing. People, I mean, I think the Prime Minister is his own FIPB, if I may point out. He's abroad so often, he's meeting investors, his ministers are meeting investors. You don't really need an office sitting in Delhi clearing files. So I think what they've acknowledged over here is that the FIPB was born out of an era of control, where you were controlling, you were avoiding foreign investment from coming in except on your terms. Today, India is open for business, and they're acknowledging it by saying there are no special mechanisms here. We have our rules. You can come in, you're free to travel the country, do your due diligence, come and talk to us and invest, just like it is in any other country.
Very interesting point. We're going to go over to Mr. Vivek Law, who's been patched on to this telecast all over again. Mr. Law, we were talking about the FIPB and the fact that the government has abolished the FIPB, which means that the FDIs will now have a single window clearance under the automatic route in India. But one thing is very certain, this would open up the debate on the impact of the survival of small enterprises and the fragmented and the unorganized sector in India. You've got the Kirana stores, the mom and pop stores. If I could rewind your memory back into the point when we used to debate about the FDI in retail, we were always questioning what really will now happen to the incumbents. And this is the same question that we can throw to you now as well.
Right. So basically, Chaiti, as he himself mentioned, you see 90% of approvals on FDI are anyway in the automatic route. So I think FIPB was an entity, was a bureaucratic entity which had far outlived its utility. It was a relic of the past. It needed to go. And I think it's a good thing that he sent it. Now, does that mean that you're throwing open the floodgates? He has said that for the balance 10%, in certain sectors where FDI hasn't been completely allowed, they're going to come up with certain fresh norms. So I don't think the abolition of the FIPB is to be seen with equal to you throwing open a regime where anyone can come in and do any business that they want. I think it was more a bureaucratic entity which perhaps had far outlived its utility and it needed to go. And I think that's a good thing, because if you are shutting down certain parts of the government, mind you, this was the government which came on the promise of minimum government and maximum governance. So I think it is more about the larger reform measure where you're saying that 90% is already automatic, right? So why should you have FIPB in the first place?
Sure.
So I think that's perfectly, it's a great move.
Sure, Vivek. Mr. Brajeshwar, you want to weigh in on this as well?
I wanted to weigh in because I think one of the points the finance minister made when he was setting the stage for his speech was he referred to one external headwind. He said he anticipates the Federal Reserve will continue to raise the interest rates as they've announced, and they will cut back on quantitative easing. And he said FDI cannot be taken for granted. I mean, whether there's going to be a flood of cheap dollars or cheap euros coming to the country in the future is not something you can rely on. He has done other steps also, where very subtly some changes in MAT, in the way that can be done, some things about rehabilitation of people who've already invested in mutual funds. He's tried to make some concession to FDI and to promote it through some fiscal measures as well. That's not going to be the end of the story. As the year unfolds, if there's monetary tightening in the US and perhaps in Europe and elsewhere also, the flow of FDI into our equity markets may reduce. It may reduce into the bond market, and the government will from time to time take more measures to promote foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investment. Some steps are tucked away into the fiscal details of the budget. I'm certain we'll be talking about them later. But it's a high priority for the government. Given the sort of headwinds they're anticipating, how do they encourage and promote the flow of FDI?
Right, and the government has announced several measures for the energy sector as well. Some of these are the proposal to merge state oil companies to create a behemoth with 100 billion valuations, 2 more strategic petroleum reserves planned apart from 3 already, which have already been completed. Mr. Sanjeev Ahluwalia, who is still with us, this question is really for you. What really will be the implication of this merger of the oil companies really?
Yeah, I mean, there's one issue here that there are a lot of public sector companies out there, and they're all, of course, separated sort of vertically and doing their own job, distribution, refining, and so on, exploration, gas. Now, if you try and merge all of these into one big, huge oil company, which you can probably market overseas as a behemoth you mentioned, it's a good idea, but whether it is sensible from the corporate point of view, whether there are synergies there that can be extracted, whether there are efficiencies that will result, I'm afraid I think you would need to study that very, very closely. The history of mergers, of big companies is littered with high costs which are incurred and errors which are made due to not realizing that, firstly, merging 3 or 4 different cultures itself into one company is a problem. And then whether the business opportunities come thereafter or not is another big issue over there. So I think this is a statement of intention. There'll be a lot more debate going forward, and one will have to see whether this serves the role that the public sector is meant to play in the government. Mind you, many would say that, look, why are these companies in the public sector in the first place? Why are all these refining companies?
Absolutely, looking around everywhere in the world.
Why have they not been privatized already? We were trying to privatize them, in the 2000s. But it didn't happen. So, I think to make them even less privatizable and to try and replicate a Malaysian company or a Chinese company, whether that's the route we should go or whether we should make our public sector as nimble as our private sector is, that's a debate.
Sure.
I think you have to enter into that.
Sure. Now, if you actually look at, crude oil prices, they've been really fluctuating. The very fact that the government is now trying to bring this all together, do you think it is to kind of balance that out, that we as India as a larger entity can go out and then join hands with Russia and China to negotiate better oil prices, or do you think that that's not been accounted for?
Well, I think definitely, from the government's point of view, having a huge, large company which you can market overseas, as I said, as a significant player, does have advantages. But you have to weigh that against all the other negative issues that come up, including, the lack of competition then that arises. Remember, we have a problem with public sector companies in the sense they're part of the state. It's very difficult to regulate them. Once everything becomes in-house, you're going all the way from drilling to, manning a pump. All those costs become internalized. And though the efficiency points no longer remain publicly available, as a citizen, I'm worried about that.
For sure.
We're staying with the crude oil prices really. We saw that earlier the government really benefited a lot in terms of tax collections when the crude oil pricing was flirting around $30 a barrel. Then the new normal set in after the OPEC meeting happened, and 50 to 55 thereabout dollars per barrel has become the new normal, and now they're pegging that the crude oil prices will rise to about $70 per barrel globally. Do you think India is ready to take this kind of an excise duty hit in terms of the gains that the exchequer was really making and capitalizing on the crude oil prices being low and the margins for the excise being so high in the past couple of years?
Well, that's an excellent question, and the Finance Minister has not shared how the 2017-18 budget, what is the assumption over there? There are lots of assumptions which have not been shared yet. And I certainly think that, if there is a crude oil price, all those early gains which allowed us to tick several boxes lower commodity prices, low inflation, huge fiscal reserves. Those will all have to be questioned, and I think alternative mechanisms would have to be adopted.
Let's move on to the healthcare sector. The government announced action plan to eliminate Kala Azar and filariasis by 2017. 1.5 lakh health sub-centers to be converted to health and wellness centers. 2 new AIIMS, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, to be built up in Jharkhand and Gujarat. Drugs and cosmetic rules to be amended to enhance availability of generic drugs. Allocation to National Health Mission has been increased. Vivek, if you are still there, the government announced similar SOPs last year as well. But the question lies in whether it has any ground impact at all.
If you allow me, Rohit, I just want to come in on a point that Mr. Ahluwalia made on your earlier question, which was on the merger of these oil companies. You've just got to look at the banking space. You've got to look at the telecom space. For the last 10 years, every 6 months, you see this trial balloon going out, MTNL and BSNL to merge. We've been talking about even merging the State Bank of India and its the other banks within the State Bank of India fold, the 5 of them. This is, as Mr. Ahluwalia said, it's a statement of intent. I would take that with a lot of pinch of salt. To get 2 PSUs to merge, it has a whole lot of issues which he articulated on. Now, let's get to the healthcare question that you actually posed. There has been talk of the fact that, prices of stents, etc., need to be brought down. He's talked about some of those measures. I think the interesting thing there is, for senior citizens, the Aadhaar-enabled smart card, which will actually capture your records. I think that, from a long-term point of view, especially for the senior citizens, and presuming that that is the age when you really actually start, to have far more health ailments, I think that's a big innovative announcement of this budget.
Mr. Law, also have the masses really benefited from these kind of measures as well?
Well, that's tough to say, Chetty, because a lot of these announcements, take years to actually trickle down. The budget, as again, one of the speakers mentioned earlier, it's more like a statement of intent. I would like to do this. I would like to do this kind of a thing. And if you recall, the finance minister himself, I think I counted it 4 times, said that the prime minister announced it on December 31st. So it's not that, you'll hear a lot of things in terms of what we intend to do. Is that going to translate immediately into action on the ground? That's not really the case.
Now we move on to education sector. The government announced increased focus on SWAYAM platform for distance learning, proposal to launch the system of measuring learning in schools, allocation of 2,200 crores for investment in vocational training, innovation funds for secondary education to be created.
Mr. Brajeshwar Singh, you have served in the government. All these are great measures, but the ASA reports time and again point to the quality of poor education in India. Will these measures really improve that?
Well, primary education is very much something which the state governments have to do. So the government of India can act as a sort of catalytical role. It can set standards. It can try and encourage the states. But the response of the states has been very patchy. And particularly what are the Hindi-speaking states where even primary education hasn't had a great breakthrough. The major gains in education are going to come from the primary stage, and they're going to come from universalization. It is not just writing, which is our definition of literacy, but also reading and arithmetic. Without basic numerical skills, the transition from the informal to the formal economy, or the transition from cash payments to cashless or digital payments simply can't take place. I mean, providing the infrastructure for the optic fiber thing is just one part of it. You've got to have the human resources adequately trained. And the maximum return is going to come from universalization of primary education. I think these measures are part of what is already a declared mission, to universalize primary education. But there's very little the central government can do where the states are not sufficiently responsive. I think the big game changer is going to be GST, because GST, which is what the finance minister himself described as a tectonic shift, and that was his description of it, is going to put more funds in the hands of the state government. So the state governments should be able to spend more on the social sector, both health and education, than they have been doing in the past. This should produce a better performance or a better throughput from the state governments, and that will be the big change for education and the whole social sector, not just the central government allocations.
The finance minister talked about several things, but he left out a couple of things as well. What they did not talk about, there was no mention of Nirbhaya Fund, smart cities, and Amrut were not mentioned for the urban people left out of the budget. I think the overall, if you looked at the budget, there was not much stress on urban development in the budget. This time, what is the reason for the same? We have to keep looking forward. I think what he's put out is a budget which kind of looks at where India is headed, what direction it's going to take, and certainly what's going to be important is a more robust economy. Banking on the demonetization that has taken place, also banking on infrastructure growth, which certainly will bring about the changes that he thinks will be required out of India. We want to talk a bit about what this is finally going to do. A few lines to wrap up on what do you think this budget really did?
Well, across the board, India Incorporated is saying that this is a very fiscally prudent budget, and that's a reaction that we're garnering from most of our guests in the studio as well. A big push is given to digital literacy in India as well, big push given to infrastructure as well. Disinvestment is another big takeaway of the budget as well. And of course, it is not populous as we thought it would be ahead of the 5 state elections, but the next budget would be the one to watch out for, which is ahead of the elections as well. So perhaps all in all, the finance minister has been cautiously optimistic in his stance, and fiscal prudence seems to be the buzzword this time.
Thanks, Prajesh, and thank you, Sanjeev, for joining us in the studio. Thank you, Mr. Vivek Law. Finally, Budget 2017-18 has been presented. Now we will see for the next 1 year what this delivers to India. Thanks for watching, and thanks for watching Gravitas. Good night and good luck.